Greetings to baristas. As you can see, I'm participating in No Shave November. And as you've also doubtless heard by now, Officer Darren Wilson of the Ferguson Police has been acquitted by the state grand jury for many charges of police misconduct or homicide arising from his confrontation with the deceased Michael Brown. These players have followed their part of the script, standing by the police in their struggle to keep the public safe and free from gangsters and thugs by any means necessary. The protesters, in turn, followed their role. Angry pressure from the street exploding into irrational acts of random violence to vent their outrage at yet another example of their impotence, their immateriality, before the holders of power in an allegedly representative democracy. It's easy to see the mentality at work in the grand jury, their desire to stand by the law and above the mob in the street and not to seem to be giving in to it. The actual chargeability of Officer Darren Wilson's actions seem in turn to have been secondary to the politics of the case. The protesters' vocality and visibility added to this social resentment. What we're seeing is a resurgence of the politics of the 1960s, with white Americans siding with the police out of backlash resentment against black violence. We have Sergeant I'm Gonna Fucking Kill You posited against the outrage of black street thugs. But it's more than just a street theater reenactment of the 1960s. There's a larger context at play in the nature of this police confrontation with citizens. It's what Malcolm X, referring to the original Civil War of the 1960s, called chickens coming home to roost. He made that statement in a speech of December 1963 in reference to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. 50 years ago, as now, the U.S. was involved in an expanding global power struggle. Like President Obama, Kennedy had authorized the use of targeted special ops assassinations in conducting low-profile dirty wars. But, as now, the expanding collateral demands of occupation, of snuffing out the commies, the terrorists, etc., led to entire national populations being seen as the enemy. The only good gook was a dead one, harking back to the original conquest of North America itself. The emergence of SWAT teams was an outgrowth of Vietnam tactics brought home to American society in policing the Viet Cong of America's own cities. Since the so-called War on Terror, we've seen the militarizing of American police rise exponentially. What began in the 1960s could not then override the liberal bourgeois tradition of civil law. But since the end of the Cold War, we've seen this tendency creep from the margins into center stage. The American president orders things done that were stopped as shameful atrocities a generation ago. And the media and political establishment lets him get away with it. Anyone in Iraq or Afghanistan who resisted the barked order of an American soldier with a gun was treated as a terrorist, and the entire civil population of villages, cities, and provinces were put under the rule of many Sergeant I'm Gonna Fucking Kill Yous. It's not hard to see where I'm going, because the conclusion is obvious. The people of the United States are becoming as much the enemy as the villagers of Iraq or the rebel tribesmen of Afghanistan. They are to be browbeaten, surveilled, searched, questioned, and raided with no talk back allowed. In the name of what? Freedom? National security? This is one example of blowback, or chickens coming home to roost, to use Malcolm X's old folk saying. When the Brazilian army took power in 1964 and instituted its new national security state, General Gilberto Couto e Silva defined its founding concept as follows. Today, the concept of war has been expanded to the entire territorial space of the belligerent states, thus involving the whole economic, political, cultural, and military capacity of the nation in the enormity of the struggle. All activities are focused on one single aim, victory and only victory. No distinction is made between soldiers and civilians, men, women, and children. They face the same danger, and identical sacrifices are demanded of them. They must all abdicate the secular liberties which had been won at such high costs, and place them in the hands of the state, the all-powerful Lord of War. Above all, total war is eliminated the time scale, incorporating in itself the time of pre-war and post-war, which are in fact only now extensions of one sole and continuing state of war. This is quoted directly from source documents in this volume, State and Opposition in Military Brazil, by the Brazilian dissident Maria Helena Moreira Alves. No one in the National Security Agency, the Obama administration, or the commanding officers of the Joint Special Operations Command could have stated their case better. What's good for the armed forces, national or local, is good for society. In fact, there should be no separation between them. Civil society as understood in 3 to 4 centuries of bourgeois law, should cease to exist in any meaningful restricting sense. So what's good for an occupied nation like Afghanistan becomes good for America. And the disobedient of Ferguson, Missouri deserve no greater consideration than those wicked, naughty folk of Fallujah, Iraq. That is one prime example of chickens coming home to roost. In 1963, just 51 years before the Ferguson grand jury verdict, we saw a second example, as stated by Malcolm X, in the form of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Kennedy, you might again recall, was the executive initiator of targeted assassinations abroad, like President Diem of the Republic of Vietnam, or General Rafael Trujillo, God's benefactor of the Dominican Republic, or Patrice Lumumba, first elected Prime Minister of independent Congo. So, given the sheer hatred of President Obama by his opposition, and given his administration's track record, it might behoove the Secret Service to draw the lessons of history and ramp up their obligation to shield the Commander-in-Chief. Ferguson is just another dark cloud in a fog descending over the country, because in this century the USA stands much closer to the open fascism of Brazil's national security state than in the 1960s. At this rate, within a decade, we will see authorized torture in American jails to equal Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo, the ability of Sergeant I'm Gonna Fucking Kill You to make good his threat with no questions asked, with Ferguson becoming the new normal, with targeted assassinations happening in American streets to even American civil or political leaders. All in the name of keeping America strong and free. But in the name of whom exactly? Uh-oh, timely knock on the tube line. Maybe that's the answer to my question. Hello? Who is it? Why, hey there, Charlie Coke. What do you want to add for the benefit of our select viewing audience? That the rabble in the street need to know that they deserve only the representative government they can pay for. What if they're too broke by low wages and high prices to pay for their rights? Then it's the duty of the law to protect the rights of those who can pay for them. And if you have your way, that'll be even fewer and fewer of them. What's that? Well, that's how it's supposed to work, how it should be, because this is a republic, not a democracy, and we have to keep it that way. Now, we doesn't include any of us in the audience, does it? Now, what's that? No, I'm not in Ferguson, Missouri, not in Fallujah, Iraq either. You don't have to be. Does the color of ants make any difference when you pulverize the mound?